He'd had apparently 42 stubbies and 30 bongs. And despite ingesting so many substances, he was still able to produce a gun. And although his judgment was impaired, his aim was not impaired. In this case, the target wasn't an empty shop, but someone who fought fire with gunfire. I'm Andrew Rule and this is Life and Crimes. We often wonder what happens when people dare to defend their homes against intruders. And this is a subject that is becoming more relevant every week, particularly in Melbourne. And, of course, in some other parts of Australia, notably Alice Springs and probably Darwin, and certain other hotspots around the country where home invasion's rife, and to use the words of one magistrate, crime is rampant. We have a situation where people, ordinary householders, or at least certain householders, who are thinking, how can I defend my home and my family and myself, and how will the law view it if I do? How far can I go? Now, this is a thorny subject, but it seems to me that with some exceptions, that those few people who have taken up arms against intruders in their own house have by and large not been prosecuted by the law. Now, there are exceptions to this, but it's interesting that although the official police attitude and the attitude of the government authorities and so on is do not take on intruders, do not offer resistance, do not get in their way, just play safety first at all times. If you've got to throw them the car keys or whatever it is, just do it. And that, by and large, is good advice. And we would not be advocating for people to do anything rash or stupid and dangerous because they shouldn't do it. But some people, in some circumstances, will and have. And it's possible that some people that have defended themselves are bits of scallywags themselves. The most notable example of self-defence, of course, in this jurisdiction is Mick Gatto, who shot Andrew Veneman in a very quiet, small space in a restaurant in Carlton. And he was finally acquitted on self-defence. But of course, he said he'd been attacked by a notorious hitman who did have form for shooting people and carrying guns and so on and so forth. And so that really wasn't a great example of intruders getting into your house in the suburbs and looking for your car keys or your wallet or whatever. Let's go through a few of these. In 1992, a shooter's advocate, an activist called Laurie Morris, sat up in an empty house that he owned. I think it had been his mother's house and he owned it and it was empty, and he knew that people were regularly coming to that house and looting it, breaking in, and they were stripping it of valuables. It was a house, I think, in Malvern or that district, and there were features of the house that were worth stealing, and people were stealing them, and he got heartily sick of it. He was a sporting shooter, a responsible, licensed shooter, not a lunatic and not a criminal. And in the end, he couldn't stop these thefts happening, and he went and sat up in that house at night. Now, I'm not sure how many nights he spent there, but he spent nights there, and sure as eggs are eggs, 3 intruders turned up one night. There was a confrontation, and Laurie Morris shot one of these intruders. And that intruder, I have to say, ended up grievously injured. He ended up, I think, with a permanent colostomy bag. It meant that he couldn't, as he said to media later on, this intruder, he said, I can't play with my son in the park and run around the way that I want to with my children, etc., etc., all of which was true, and it's a terrible thing. However, he and 2 others thought it was fine to steal stuff from somebody's house, and in the end, he ran into a homeowner that fought back. The interesting point here is that although there was a lot of debate about this because Laurie Morris was in fact a prominent sporting shooter who was a known advocate for gun ownership, etc. He had a sort of a political view to push. Morris became a slightly notorious case, but he was acquitted of any charges that were levelled, and everyone went home. The injured intruder went home with his bullet wounds, and Laurie Morris went home with his reputation and his wallet intact. Didn't go to jail, not even fined, I believe, and ultimately he was acquitted of home defence using a firearm. There have been other examples. Some have gone one way, some have gone the other. I'll just throw in one now from the opposite side. And that was in 2014, a fellow called Ivan D'Angelo, D''Angelo, he got 8 years for manslaughter. Now, there's some interesting things here that make it rather different from Laurie Morris's experience. Similar was this. Ivan knew that people were breaking into his workshop, where I think he used to sleep or something. They were breaking into his workshop in Thomastown and stealing stuff. And he had started to sleep there or whatever, and he was sleeping there. And on this particular night that 3 intruders turned up to break into his workshop in Thomastown, Ivan had a big night. He'd had apparently 42 stubbies and 30 bongs. And despite ingesting so many substances, he was still able to produce a gun. And although his judgment was impaired, I'd suggest that if he was dead sober, he might not have opened fire quite so readily. His aim was not impaired, and he hit at least one of these fellows and shot him dead. And he was subsequently charged with manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. And the judge and jury took a fairly dim view of his actions. The fact that he was, nearly blind drunk when he did it probably didn't help his cause. If you're defending your home as opposed to just running around in circles because you're drunk and off your head on dope, it's probably not going to play that well in court. And it did not, and he got 8 years in the slammer, or he was at least sentenced to 8 years in the slammer. He shot dead a 27-year-old young man called Wade Vandenberg. Recently, we've had the case, I'm just picking a few at random, we've had the case of Mick Malthouse, former tough defender in the VFL and AFL world, who became a tough AFL coach. Mick Malthouse, flinty, hard little man, little by AFL standards, not little anywhere else, came out of Ballarat from sort of the tough side of the tracks. I think he might have grown up in a housing commission estate up there, and probably society didn't do him a lot of favours, and he fought his way up the greasy pole of sport, football and everything else by dint of his own determination and his own efforts and his own courage. And probably the sort of guy who you wouldn't really want to rob because he'd be pretty willing to have a shot back. When some intruders intruded on his property at East Melbourne this year, he didn't have a gun, but he did have an exercise bar, which is another word for an iron bar. And he took his iron bar, which he always called an exercise bar because, it's part of exercise equipment, of course. He just happened to have it beside the bed. And he went downstairs and he chased away 3 men, one of whom actually kicked him or something. There was a bit of aggro. I think one of them hurt him with a screwdriver, a small wound, but anyway. The screwdriver was no match for Mick and his iron bar, and he dispensed a bit of summary justice, and later on the police got hold of these people, I think. And I would have thought that nearly all Victorians, if not all Australians, would have been barracking for Mick Malthouse in that incident. He took what was at hand and took them on. Now, the police do not recommend doing that, but Mick Malthouse, like a lot of people of his character, is not one to take a backward step. We recall that with the late, great Ron Barassi when he saw a lady being attacked or mugged or robbed or something in St Kilda at a pavement cafe, I think it was. Barassi, who was then, I think, in his 70s at that stage, jumped up and intervened and tried to grab the offender, the attacker, and I think was knocked over for his troubles. But it shows you the calibre of the man and of people like him. They're not going to back down. And speaking of people who don't back down, we're talking about January the 7th last year, 2024. And the way I've written this story is this way, and we try and stick to the written form because our lawyers are very keen for us to be very careful how we describe people and events. And so, with a few minor variations, I'm going to stick to the written form of this story, which I find quite interesting. The raiders, in this case, came prepared to do maximum harm. Between three of them, they had 3 axes, a jerry can of petrol, and an aerosol can of a very common solvent, WD-40, all bought under a false name to go with the gloves, the disposable black clothes, and makeshift balaclavas. They make them up out of T-shirts, interestingly. They can twist a T-shirt around so they can see through the hole and then tie it off in a knot. Instant bala. There you go. It's one of those little skills that young people learn these days. And some postcodes. They also had false number plates fitted to the Toyota Kluger that they drove to the scene of the crime. Our friends at Toyota would point out that the Toyota is a very reliable conveyance at all times, and in this case it was extremely reliable, more reliable than the people driving it. Any doubt that this was a criminal enterprise vanished when the 3, directed by a 4th man, so this is a conspiracy, smashed through a bedroom window of a house in Middlemount Street, Donnybrook, which used to be farm country, I can recall, now an outer suburb to the north of Melbourne, out there past Epping and so on. It's 4:18 a.m. on this particular morning, January the 7th, last year, 2024. When they break the windows with the axes, it showers the bedroom, with broken glass. In the bedroom, in bed, is a terrified woman, a woman called Taylor Grannon. And she's sort of the lady of the house. She is the partner or girlfriend of the chap who's the co-tenant. Taylor is sleeping alone on this particular occasion for reasons that will become clear. And she leapt from the bed and crouched against a wall, absolutely terrified, but was struck on her left leg with an axe, gashing it very badly. Well, it would. It's an axe. Taylor screamed that she was pregnant, and the attackers, thank goodness, left her alone and ran from the room towards the back of the house, clearly looking for her partner, a chap called Darcy Curran. Now, Darcy Curran, I think, was a 28-year-old fellow. We don't know a lot about Darcy, but I think he's not a shrinking violet. I think Darcy might be a robust individual. And I think it's possible that Darcy had an inkling that some people were out to take property of his, possibly money or possibly something else. But he probably might have been expecting trouble. Darcy Curran, who later told police he had been sleeping in the backyard, which I suppose on a hot January night you might do, he confronted the 3 men with the axes, and those men found they'd made the fatal mistake of bringing axes to a gunfight. Curran, and this is where the lawyers tell us to be careful, Curran took hold of a firearm, its origin uncertain, and fired several shots. He hit 2 of the attackers. One man, a man whose name we are not going to use here, but we'll call him Harry, he fled with a 3rd man, which his mates call Babyface. We don't know who he is. We actually don't know who Babyface is or was, but his nickname that they used in text messages was Babyface. So the wounded fellow and a 3rd man rush off to the Toyota Kluger and drive away. They head for hospital. The 3rd of the raiders a fellow called Joseph Romano wasn't running anywhere because he'd been shot in the chest. First responders worked on Joseph Romano on the nature strip, but he was declared dead at 5:01 a.m. So the attack happens at 4:18, and within probably 25 seconds or something, there's lots of shooting by Darcy Curran, who lives at the house. We're not sure where the gun came from, but apparently Darcy was able to put his hand on it. It's possible that he took it from one of the attackers. It's possible.
Hi, it's Gary Jubilant here. Do you want a real and raw look inside the world of crime? Well then check out my podcast, I Catch Killers, where I interview people from all sides of the law.
I draw my firearm and I went into fight mode. I wanted to find and confront this gunman.
I'm not getting verbaled, am I?
I shouldn't have trusted you. See, I'm trying to open my mind up to defence powers.
I know, it's just begging to be said.
Yeah, fair call, fair call. We have amazing guests every week. Search for I Catch Killers wherever you get your podcasts.
The wounded man and his mate Babyface drove to the Northern Hospital, and he was captured on security cameras there just before 4:30, struggling out of the back seat of the Toyota. He was then taken to the Royal Melbourne Hospital with gunshot wounds to the back and buttocks. So he apparently had turned around and was heading outwards when he was shot because he got wounds in the back and the buttocks. It would take Taylor Grannon another half hour to get to the same hospital, the Northern Hospital, to have her leg wound attended to. This, of course, is the leg wound inflicted by the axe. Meanwhile, her partner, the quick-thinking shooter, Darcy Curran, left the house in the minutes before police arrived. Interestingly, another bloke whose name we are not going to use here, but we'll call him the Fourth Beetle, was one of the conspirators to do the raid, but he wasn't on the raid. He wasn't one of the three axe-wielding people. He'd helped set it up. He's not there, but he's keeping track of what's happening. Now, if this Darcy Curran was some sort of have-a-go hero, as we say in newspapers, he was very modest about it and not anxious to burden the police with details of his home defence or the possible reasons for the attack. The 28-year-old, that's his age, was not interviewed until later, after a gun was recovered from a house in a nearby suburb of Doreen. So it would appear that Darcy and possibly the gun ended up in Doreen pretty rapidly after this shooting. There was stark evidence of the chaos at the Middlemount Street house in Donnybrook. The chaos would suggest there'd been a very grievous Donnybrook at Donnybrook. Police and ambulance officers found an axe on the floor of the front bedroom, and they found two other axes that had been dropped on the front lawn by the two fleeing and terrified raiders, one of them wounded. Empty cartridge cases, all fired from the same weapon, were strewn around the place. Meanwhile, elsewhere it was time for the remnants of the raiding party to clean up after themselves or try to. It turned out that they weren't much better at this part of the operation than in the absolute debacle of the raid itself. At 8:25 a.m. that morning, so this is about 4 hours after the bungled raid, Joseph Romano's, he's the dead guy, Joseph Romano's Holden, Colorado, was caught on CCTV travelling in tandem with the Kluger getaway car at Beveridge, which is further north than Donnybrook. Beveridge is where Ned Kelly was born and raised, in fact, just past Craigieburn. At 9:22 a.m, so that's another hour again, 9:22 a.m, the Colorado was found on fire on the old Sydney Road. But this attempted torching failed, and Romano's phone was found in the vehicle, still functional. Well, this is very handy for the police. It wasn't part of the plan to leave the phone there and not burn it. The police got hold of the phone, which wasn't even scorched, and they were able to retrieve a trove of incriminating encrypted signal messages. it held, which allowed them to build a clear sequence of events by these young crooks. They were very young, these guys. A couple of them were 19. The dead guy, I think, was 19, and the other wounded guy was 19. And I think Babyface was about the same age. The Toyota Kluger, was set alight in Belfast Avenue, Broadmeadows. So that's the second car they've torched later that morning. But by that time, police were already preparing to arrest the wounded man in hospital. The wounded man we will call Harry, which is not his real name. Harry is a name that we've just made up on the run, so it bears no real resemblance to this man. The signal message exchanges that the investigators uncovered revealed a chain of events indicating a criminal conspiracy orchestrated from a long way off, much like the rash of arson attacks on tobacco outlets in recent years. But of course this one a bit less successful, because in this case the target wasn't an empty shop, but someone who fought fire with gunfire. This is what the police found out when they cracked the code on the phone. Not long before the so-called Donnybrook, the raiding party set up a group chat on Signal. This is how the police use phones. They're very good at it. Now, Harry had the handle G. He's just called G in these group chats. The fourth Beatle, not his real name, was there. Joseph Romano, who was later deceased, was called Jumpman. And the unknown offender, as we know, was called Babyface. So this is on January the 6th last year, the day before the bungled raid. These four are chatting on Signal to toss around plans with a fifth person known as Carnage. Now, we don't know who that is, and if we did, we probably wouldn't name him. Carnage is almost certainly some sort of lieutenant for an absentee criminal overlord. He will be a right-hand man doing the dirty work, in setting up the dirty work back home here in Melbourne for a paymaster who is somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere else like that. Now, this Carnage, so-called, he either rose very early or he stayed up all night, as it was 5:57 a.m, that's just before 6 o'clock, when he sent a group message asking for the clothing sizes of those in the group. 3 hours later, Harry was up and about. He provided a shopping list for the fourth Beatle, and the list said 3 large jumpers, 3 large pants, 3 pairs of shoes, 2 in size 10 and 1 in size 13, so someone had big feet, and 3 T-shirts to be used as balaclavas. Now, Harry then transmitted a Bunnings shopping list asking for the 3 axes and a spray can of WD-40. Fourth Beatle responded with one word, sweet. All-purpose word, very handy. The fourth Beatle, who's 24 years old, so he's 5 years older than the silly young blokes they sent to do the job. This Beatle drove to Bunnings in Hawthorne, a store with which this department is very familiar. It's a very fine shop with lots of good products, and that's why the crooks went there. They wanted good products. And he bought the 3 Trojan brand fiberglass axes, nothing but the best, 3 pairs of gloves, a 5-litre red jerry can, and, of course, that pressure can of WD-40. He made the purchase under the name Matthew Trotter, an alias he'd used previously. Well, that tells you that this was a crooked transaction for where he's up to no good, because he's using the false ID, and that he used it before, which means he was the sort of bloke who uses false ID, which some would consider a mark of criminality. This fourth Beatle fellow also bought the home invasion costumes, anonymous and disposable clothing, to be worn, then destroyed. Just so they're all in black and they all look much the same, and then they burn it. That's the theory. By 12:53 that day, this is the day before the raid, the 6th of January, Carnage messaged the Beatle for details about the Donnybrook house. The beetle met Romano to hand over the gear he'd bought. 3 hours later, Romano travelled to Clifton Hill in his Holden, Colorado, with Harry. Just after midnight, Carnage was back on signal with a cryptic message that was clear to his co-conspirators. Hectic we in areas. Now, I think there's an absent question mark in that short message of 4 words. I think he's asking if they're all set up in the right area to do the business. Babyface replied by text, "Yeah, my bro, just waiting." Shortly after 4 a.m, Harry, Romano and Babyface, the unknown offender, headed to Donnybrook in their Toyota Kluger, fitted with false plates. They had the 3 axes, the jerry can of petrol and that can of WD-40. Within the hour, of course, Romano was dead, shot dead. 19 years old. Probably did this for $500 or $1,000 or whatever. 1 dead, 1 wounded and facing serious charges. These are the casualties in the dangerous and sometimes deadly war waged by organised crime bosses who recruit disorganised and deluded young pawns to do their dirty work. The details leading to the raid came to light as investigators unravelled the thread. 5 weeks after the fatal raid, and this is on February the 14th, this 4th beetle was arrested at the Berkeley Square shopping centre in Brunswick, and he was charged after refusing to answer questions or to provide a DNA sample. On August the 27th this year, so that's 18 months afterwards, the 4th beetle was sentenced to a minimum 2 years. With luck, he'll come home from prison, wise to the ways of organised crime bosses who use middlemen and patsies and pawns to insulate themselves from the crimes they plot to enrich themselves. Higher up the tree than 4th beetle in the Donnybrook disaster was the fixer codenamed Carnage, clearly a trusted lieutenant of one of the handful of puppet masters based overseas beyond the reach of Australian law enforcement. Meanwhile, officially, Joseph Romano's death is being investigated by the Homicide Squad. And this is where this gets interesting in the bigger picture. But after 20 months now, no one has been charged over his death. Homicide Squad are notionally on it. No one's been charged. It's a sign, perhaps, that someone, somewhere in the system, has judged that in the Donnybrook killing, a jury is going to be reluctant to convict a man for defending his own home against 3 axe-wielding thugs with a jerry can of petrol. No one can be dead sure who brought the gun to the axe fight, of course. Darcy Curran isn't saying that he did. Oddly, though, the encrypted telephone messages that openly listed the raiding party's axes and petrol and balaclavas never once mentioned a gun. They didn't say, while you're down there, can you drop into Charlie's and pick up the gun or, whatever. None of that. No mention of a gun. What those messages did mention was that the aerosol can of WD-40. But what was it for? Well, you can bet it wasn't for fixing a squeaky car door. The ugly truth, it seems to me, and this is a throw at the stumps, listeners, this is not police evidence, this is just an observation. The ugly truth, it seems to me, is that an aerosol can full of flammable solvent could make a cheap, off-the-shelf explosive device if subjected to the sort of heat a petrol fire produces. Call it a $10 bomb. A defence lawyer could do quite a lot by flagging that idea. So it's no surprise, really, that so few people have been charged, let alone convicted, for defending themselves against home invaders. And that dangerous Darcy Curran is one of them. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.